White privilege, does it actually exist in Canada? Or another way of considering it is, in law, do white people actually have a privileged position before the law in Canada? That's what we're going to look at this week on Don't Talk TV. Hello, my name is Nicholas Wansbutter. I'm a lawyer in Stratford, Ontario, Canada, and welcome to Don't Talk TV. So I asked the question in the preamble, does white privilege exist for people when they're dealing with the law in Canada? I think this is a very valid question because it's something that we still hear a fair bit about, as we talked about last week during the live. There's teachers are being provided materials, specifically at the Waterloo Oxford District Secondary School, about white privilege, white supremacy, and steps that they need to take to counteract this because it's a continuing problem. And even just the day before Canada Day last week, on my way to work on June the 30th, I heard them talking on CBC Radio Kitchener about their concerns about this upsurge in patriotism in the wake of Elbows Up and all that, and how they thought this was a problem because it was leading to, in their view, an uncritical look at Canada's history and feeding into this white privilege and white supremacy. So the people in power certainly behave as if they think white privilege is a thing that needs to be dealt with. It's certainly something that you hear a lot about in the media, but does the media and government perception match with the reality? So there's a number of areas that we can look at, and we've covered these things on Don't Talk TV, so you can look at some of the episodes I'll reference for more detail. So first, I'd start with getting bail. Is it easier to get bail as a white person, or is it not easier? Now, if it was just equal across the board, everyone had the same ease or difficulty of getting bail, that would not be white privilege. That would just be everyone being treated the same. It would be white privilege if it was easier for white people to get bail than for non-white people. But the fact of the matter is, it's actually easier to get bail if you're not white than if you are white. And this comes from section 493.2 of the Criminal Code. So I've got that up on the screen here, and this section of the Criminal Code directs justices when making a decision on bail. When it says that making a decision under this part, it's under the part of the Criminal Code that deals with bail. A peace officer, justice, or judge shall give particular attention to the circumstances of A, Aboriginal accused, and B, accused who belong to a vulnerable population that is overrepresented in the criminal justice system and that is disadvantaged in obtaining release under this part. Now, I cover this in more detail in episode 244 when we look at how this law is applied. So you can look at that section, or that episode rather, for more detail. Suffice to say that it's clearly interpreted that this does, like, white people are not disadvantaged in obtaining release under this part. Therefore, they don't get this special consideration. And really, it's everyone other than white people. So I would argue that the opposite of white privilege, white disadvantage, exists when it comes to bail. And again, we've got a link in the show description to episode 244. I recommend you have a look at that for more detail and more in-depth analysis on that. We could also look at sentencing. Do white people get lower sentences than non-white people? Now, I think if you read the media, legacy media, you would get the impression that white people get a lighter touch in the criminal justice system. But again, we'll have a look at the Criminal Code. Now we're looking at section 718 of the Criminal Code, which lays out a number of principles. The first principles are laid out in the early parts of section 718. 718.2 lays out other sentencing principles. And they mention a number of aggravating features here, but if we go down, they indicate that here under subsection E, all available sanctions other than imprisonment that are reasonable in the circumstances and consistent with the harm done to victims to the community should be considered for all offenders with particular attention to the circumstances of Aboriginal offenders. So we see some repeated language between the bail provisions and the sentencing provisions. And again, I've talked about this in more detail. Have a look at episode 204. That's 204, where I go into this in more detail, look at some case law of how this has been interpreted, and it becomes very clear that it's not just Aboriginal offenders, it's everyone who's not white gets this special consideration. So again, I would argue that the opposite of white privilege exists under Canada's sentencing regime, because although one might say you don't necessarily get a harder ride if you're white, you certainly don't have access to the easier ride that's laid out in section 718.2 sub E, or the potentially easier ride. And again, we see how this is applied in episode 204, so have a look at that. Another thing I would point out in law, I covered this in episode 197, but really if you just have a look at the hate crime playlist that we have, look at what is considered hate crime. 199 would cover that off. 197 is where they defined white nationalist terrorism. That relates to the incident in London a few years ago where a mentally deranged individual drove over a family of Muslims, and it was deemed that this is a terrorism offense. You can look at 199, 197, and everything under the playlist. You'll see a theme of what gets prosecuted, what's considered hate crime and what isn't. And I'm not aware, and I'd appreciate if you're aware of any example, leave a comment in the comments section. But I'm not aware of there ever having been found a hate crime against a white person. And has anyone heard of any other kind of terrorism in Canada that's actually been prosecuted? I mean, people like Omar Khadr, he got $10 million for fighting with the Taliban and throwing a grenade and killing a medic who's a non-combatant protected under the Geneva Conventions. But he got sent to Guantanamo Bay, so therefore he got $10 million. I'm only aware in any recent years of this white nationalist terrorism being a thing, and certainly I've only ever spoken to CSIS agents and RCMP agents in connection with suspected white supremacy terrorism, not for any other form of terrorism. So now that's anecdotal, but I think you look at the case law and what's being brought before the courts, that also suggests to me that at minimum, there's an even playing field. The police are not turning a blind eye if it's white people doing it, which is what white privilege would be. That certainly is not the case. So I would suggest that that's another area where we can say that white privilege does not exist in law. And then we have human rights. And this is very clear from the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal. I have this decision, Gleb Lissick and His Majesty the King in Right of Ontario is represented by the Ministry of Education. So this is a decision from 2022. We've got the citation here, 2022 HRTO 1345. I found it on Canly. Link to that case is in the show description if you want to look at the full case. But if we just look at the beginning of this case, they give a little summary of what the case is all about. So this is a case brought the applicant alleged discrimination in the provision of educational services on the grounds of race and color, contrary to the Human Rights Code. The application alleges that a summer program offered to Black students in 2021 by the local school board, which was not available to white students, and which was funded in part by a grant from the Ministry of Education, was discriminatory and therefore amounts to a breach of the code. Now, it would seem to me that if something is offered to only one skin color of people, that's per se discriminatory. I mean, just flip it around. Imagine if there was a program offered only to white students. That would be clearly discriminatory. I mean, that's the definition of discrimination. You discriminate or differentiate between other people. I'm not saying whether you should be allowed to do that or not. I'm just saying what the word discrimination is, and the fact that the human rights codes allegedly forbid that. But let's look at the key part. Paragraph 19 is a key piece of this decision. I mean, this is where the decision comes down to right here. Paragraph 19. It is important to note in the tribunal's jurisprudence that an allegation of racial discrimination or discrimination on the grounds of color is not one that can be or has been successfully claimed by persons who are white and non-racialized. So note, it's not only that it hasn't, it cannot be successful, they say right there. So clearly, there's no white privilege when it comes to our human rights code. In fact, the Human Rights Tribunal explicitly stated that white people do not enjoy protection of the Human Rights Code. Everyone else does, white people don't. Again, exact opposite of white privilege or white supremacy. And I think it's just factually wrong that to claim that there's any sort of white supremacy or white privilege in Canada. Certainly in the law, I think we've got 4 examples right here. Clearly, it does not exist in Canadian law. It's a fallacy. It's an untruth to claim that it does. And I think it's important to know that and point that out to people when they start going off on the legacy media or the government's talking points about white supremacy and white privilege. They do not actually exist, certainly not in the law. Now, all that said, this video is not legal advice. If you need legal advice, you should call a lawyer. If you want me to be that lawyer, my contact information is on the banner down below us. We're always open to suggestions, show topics, ideas, things you'd like to hear us discuss. So please leave a comment in the comment section or email us at the address listed below. And of course, we'd be happy to hear your thoughts on this episode. Do you think I'm out to lunch, or do you think, from what I've shown, it looks like white privilege actually does not exist in Canada? And as always, if you found this video interesting, helpful, informative, please consider liking, sharing, subscribing, and following us on social media.